Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to talk to you about something that's in my life. Happened a long time ago. I was 4 years old this time in my life. A fond memory. It happened at a little place near a town called Boonville. Boonville was named for a descendant, actually, of Daniel Boone. It's in Northern California. Lies back in the mountains. It lies in a beautiful little valley, bisected by Anderson Creek, about 120 miles north of San Francisco in the Coast Range. Boonville is a small town with a history, and my family plays a major part in that history. My great-great-grandfather, J.B. Sanders, James Beeson Sanders, settled there in the 1870s, very early in its history. Boonville, believe it or not, is a town with its own language. It's called Buntling, and it came from the people who settled there. Some say that it came as a result of parents working in the fields and wanting to carry on a conversation without the children knowing or understanding. Others say it came from the fact that the people from Boonville wanted to talk without the people from Philo knowing what they were saying. It's up to you. You decide which. But in that language, to go haying, to cut hay, was to go JBing. J.B. Sanders, my great-great-grandfather, owned the first hay press in the valley. Hence the name of that word. He owned a hotel there in its earlier days, having come over from Spenceville in the Gold Rush area of California. The town of Spenceville is no more. It was somewhere between Yuba City and Grass Valley, out in those hills there. And it was a copper mining town. It wasn't a gold mining town, believe it or not. But he owned a hotel there, sold out, moved over to Boonville, and reestablished one there. It's said that he once operated the stage line into and out of Boonville for a time. I don't know about that. That's family story. And one thing I found about family stories, they don't always stand up to scrutiny. But I do know this about J.B. He had a wife that was very large. Eliza Ellen East married J.B. Sanders back in Kansas where they lived. Eliza was well over 6 feet tall, weighed well over 400 pounds in her younger years, and they raised 13 children. They came from a town in Kansas called Coffeyville, and again it's rumored, but this story came from J.B. himself, that Jesse James once used his barn for a hideout overnight. The first thing they did when they came to the area is started a process called jayhawking. And what that was, the area grew profusely with tan oak. And the bark on tan oak was loaded with the tannins that are used to tan hides, hence the name tan oak. And they would strip that bark, dry it, and when they had a mule train load, take it to the San Francisco Bay Area, some 120, 130 miles away, and sell it. It would take 4 to 6 months to amass the amount of bark they needed for a load, and then it would take another 4 to 6 months to make the trip. Of course, when they came back in, they brought in all the supplies they were going to need for the following year. J.B. also had one of the first automobiles in Anderson Valley. It was always his goal to own an automobile, and he bought one and got it in there before the days of roads. Of course, the road into Anderson Valley still isn't a whole lot better than it was then. If you've ever been there, you know what I mean. My great-grandfather, Jim Frame, married a daughter of Eliza and J.B., Daisy Sanders. James Frame was called a lunger. He actually passed away on one of those trips out. He is buried at the old Yorktown Cemetery, Yorktown was a stage stop about halfway between the town of Cloverdale and Boonville on the grade. My mother was actually born on the family ranch just outside of Boonville and grew up, spent her younger primary years there. And they left there. Daisy Sanders and J.B. had a daughter, Ethel May Frame. Ethel married a fellow by the name of Arthur Oliver Simpson, and believe it or not, Arthur Simpson passed away early too. My mother was only about 5 years old when he passed away. They left the valley shortly thereafter. But prior to that time, they lived on the ranch with everybody else. When they made these trips to town, they made them and left the women there. And they were on the ranch. Okay, there were a couple of men. I know J.B. stayed behind. He was older by then, and there were probably a couple more. And with the number of girls that J.B. and Eliza had, I am quite sure there were a lot of guys that hung around there too. Make sure they had plenty of food and whatever was needed. They hunted, and they fished, and they grew huge gardens. And they were a family, in the best meaning of family. In 1947, right after the end of the Second World War, the national economy was in a transition from wartime economy to a peacetime economy, and jobs were rare. Not only were people being laid off from defense industries, we weren't making all those airplanes and tanks and trucks, everything to wage war across the world. We were getting back to making cars and furniture and, the things that we live with every day today. The things we take for granted. Believe me, they didn't take those for granted in those days. During the wartime, many of those things were rationed. Tires, you had to have a coupon to buy tires. You had to have a coupon to buy sugar. Story in my family, told to me by my grandfather, had visitors over and he'd pour the coffee and he said, have all the cream you want. He said, but take it easy on the sugar. Just simply because sugar was rationed. About this time, my family heard of a mill opening up and needing workers. It was at a place called Blue Hole. A Blue Hole's a canyon halfway between Boonville and the Pacific Ocean. It's 32 miles of gravel, where it's in good shape, or dirt road from Boonville out to the ocean. And believe me, last time I was on it, it was still pretty much the same shape. Well, at the 16-mile point, you turned off of that road and went down into this canyon. There was about 2 miles down into the bottom of this canyon, and that road was just nothing but dirt. There was no gravel on it. And down in the bottom, a little creek there was a sawmill built. In those days, they built sawmills right directly in the stand of timber. There was no log trucking there. There was no railroad. The logs fell and bucked, and the cat skated them right to the mill pond. Dumped them in, they were floated to the mill, and in they went, and they were sawn, and the lumber was trucked out. Had a huge wigwam burner there, burned continuously, the sawdust and the scrap from that mill. We had a cat there, as I remember. Never had whiskers because he was always down around that burner and the piles of burning, bouldering sawdust chasing the mice, and he'd singe his whiskers off. But we took a job in that mill, my dad did, and we moved out there. All there was for housing was a 3-room cabin. It had a bedroom, it had a front room, and it didn't even have a bathroom. It had a kitchen. A kitchen, a front room, and a bedroom. That was the 3 rooms. The water you carried from the spring down by the mill, up a fairly steep hill to the cabin, unless it was raining. If it was raining, we caught it as it ran off the roof. And believe me, it could rain there. And when it did, we had plenty of water. Of course, we caught some of it as it ran through the roof, too. It wasn't too well roofed. But there were only the 4 of us there. Well, there were 5 because my uncle, my mother's brother Arthur, was there with us. Myself and my younger brother were there because we were too young to farm out. I was 4, my brother was 2. Our sisters were in school, and of course there was no school there and no facilities for getting to school. So they stayed with an aunt and uncle back in our hometown of Santa Rosa and would come up occasionally on weekends. We lived there all summer. We lived there into the winter. When the rain started, there was only getting out to go to town occasionally. We had to leave a car at the top of the grade, drive from there into town, and ride the cat from the mill up to the top of the grade because a car couldn't traverse that muddy road. Go into town, of course, they'd buy groceries for the entire camp when they made the trip. My dad had a couple of stories to tell about those trips to town that were less than complimentary to some of the men that were involved there. But it was a beautiful place. This mill sat right in the huge stand of old-growth redwood timber. These were the coastal redwoods, the Sequoia sempervirens, and they were tall. They were large, too. There were many of those logs that were 8, 9 foot through, some maybe even 10 foot through in diameter. Used to have a picture of my dad standing in front of one, split in half so that the cat could skid it, and half of it is taller than he is. So that log had to be over 12 feet through because my dad was 6 feet tall. There's a big pond there on that little creek, and that's what we used for log pond. It was also an excellent home for trout, too. We tested that quite regularly. One of my very earliest memories in my life comes from that era. I remember the sawmill very vividly. I remember that cabin very vividly. I even remember trying to bring a bucket of water home for my mother one time. Didn't quite make it all the way, but I tried. My dad was a great fisherman, loved to fish trout. And right near there was the Garcia River. Now you have to remember this was private property we were on. We were there at the behest of the landowner because it was his timber we were logging and sawing. But there was no hunting, no fishing allowed. That didn't stop us. He never came around, so we were fed mostly on venison and trout. Garcia River had been closed for many years because it was a salmon steelhead running stream, and the state closed it. Now, I don't know why, because those fish run whether you're fishing or not. A couple of fishermen certainly not going to bother them. So we went fishing on the Garcia. And I remember we'd get along, and my dad would set me on a rock, and then he'd catch a grasshopper or two and go down to the stream edge. And his fishing rod was an old telescoping steel rod. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember those, but that's what we had. And he'd put a grasshopper on a hook, flip it out there, and it didn't take very many kicks, and there'd be a fish. We came around this one bend in the river, and here's this big open pool. Oh, it was gorgeous. And sunning itself out in the middle of the pool was this nice, great big trout. Oh, he was gorgeous. Dad says, "What's this?" And he set me up on a big rock where I could see. And he caught himself a fresh grasshopper, put it on his hook, flipped it out there, and that grasshopper gave a kick, another kick. About the third kick, that trout turned to him and hit him like a Polaris missile coming out of the water. I couldn't believe I got to see that. That trout fought, and he went up and down, and he just did everything. Finally, my dad had him whipped. He had him beat. But right at the edge of the bank where he was, there was about a 2-foot vertical drop down to the water. And that fish was too big to lift up on the line. He'd come off. And he couldn't jump in because that'd leave slack on the line. And in a moment's slack, and that fish would be gone. So what he did, he called me over to him. He just come around that rock on the land side and come over here to me. I couldn't figure out what he wanted, but I was always willing to help. Went over there, and he says, "Here," he says, "hold my rod." And he handed me his fishing rod. He said, "Now you hold it tight." He said, "And when I tell you to, you pull back with all of your might." Oh, you talk about a proud 4-year-old. I mean, there was nothing quite as proud as being able to do that with my dad's fishing rod. Well, I held his rod while he got in the water, and he went around behind that fish, got right up close to it, and got his hands below it, and then yelled, "Now!" And I pulled back as hard as I could, and he scooped, and that fish came flying out of the water and landed right on top of me. And I let the rod go, and I jumped on that fish. I was holding him down, or trying to. I think he was lifting me off the ground more than I was holding him down. But we had him. We had his fish. We returned home a pretty proud pair, he and I. We had conquered that great fish. As you can see in the picture, there's a dozen trout there, the largest of which is 14 inches. The one I'm talking about isn't on that board because he was too big to fit. He was larger than that. He was about 22, 23-inch fish. All were we proud. The summer was idyllic, but the coming of winter brought a deluge of rain. I mentioned the problems getting out to the road. Well, if we couldn't get cars out, they couldn't get lumber out either, which meant there was no income for the mill. They kept sawing, kept stacking it up, but then paychecks started to bounce. They weren't any good. Men can't work and not get paid. It just doesn't work. That was the death knell for Rocket Lumber Company of Blue Hole, California. One by one, cats towed one family after the next out, and away we went. That was the end of Rocket Lumber Company. We moved back to Boonville. Dad had gotten a job at the Jones Mill, which was right on Anderson Creek. As a matter of fact, we had to ford Anderson Creek to get to where the mill was, and we lived in a surplus Army mess tent. Had 4 rooms in it. My brother and I had 1 room. My parents had 1 room. The girls came back because we were in town and they could go to school there. And the girls had the other room. And the 4th room was everything. Kitchen, dining room, living room, everything but bathroom. That was outside. I can remember getting in trouble with one of my sisters one time. I had just come from around the back of the tent. She said, "What were you doing?" I thought I'd just take it a lead. See, I would take Dad's lunch down to him at the mill every day. I was 5 by this, and I'd sit there at lunchtime listening to the crew talking. Well, you can imagine the language that was used, and being a 5-year-old, I picked some of that up, and that's where that came from. It was just second nature to me. That's just what I heard. But she didn't take very kindly to that. Read me the riot act for it. I survived it. We spent the summer of 1948 at the Jones Mill. Had a wonderful time there. But then we moved back to Santa Rosa area. Dad had gotten a job as a carpenter. Carpentry was starting to open up by then. We were far enough out of the transition zone that construction was starting. And that was his first trade anyway. Believe it or not, he learned his trade as a carpenter by working WPA during the Depression, building outhouses. I know that sounds strange, but all the elements go into a well-built outhouse that go into a house, okay, including indoor plumbing. So we moved back, time moved on, and believe me, Anderson Valley, Boonville, remained a soft spot in my heart forever. All through my growing up years and my high school years, we went back many times. First of all, it was my mom's home. There was a huge old pine tree, fir tree actually, up on the ridge, way up on the mountaintop, all by itself up there. And that's where the family ranch had been. So we always knew where it was when we came into town. We could see Lone Pine up there. That was the Sanders Ranch. Last I heard, there were still Sanders in town. And we went up there. We had friends that lived there, worked sawmills there, all the way up into the late 50s. And we went back there hunting every year. Had a great time. I got my first deer there, believe it or not. So, Boonville, yeah, it's got a soft spot in my heart. I still love it. Thank you so much.